Hey everyone, thank you for coming to Phoenicia Library. We know most of you, but for those who don't know us, I'm Liz, the director, and there's Molly Kilb, the other librarian, and Ruby, our assistant director. Come on in. And we are so happy to have Eddie Moran, who is the appointed Ulster County historian. So lucky that he is that. And this is a person who loves doing original research. And he's going to be talking about Fort Shandaken and all of the Eastern Catskills during the Revolution. And it's going to be unexpected. It's not exactly what you might think. Eddie is just briefly, he is from Wallkill and he was history major at New Paltz. His one of his early fascinations was Ireland, and so his final year of college he spent in Ireland and was studying Irish history, modern Irish history, and decided he was going to live there for the rest of his life. But then, in April or March 2020, that's when he was there, and he got on the second to last flight out, came back here, had nothing to do, and then a position opened up in his hometown at the Huguenot House, which is one of the epicenters of Huguenot and Dutch history, and he's been a growing force in our area since then. Thank you so much, Eddie, for coming again. These also wanted to do a shout out to Tanya Baricolo, who is a retired from the Freeman and is videoing this for us, and also Brett Barry, who does many things, but he has Catskill Cast podcast, and so he's recording this for us for posterity and for people who couldn't make it. So thank you to them as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. That was true too. That was no exaggeration. It was the second to last flight out of Ireland, truth be told. So hello everyone. I'm so excited to be here. Again, my name is Eddie Moran, and I have the great privilege of serving as the Ulster County historian. And so today I'll be presenting about, of course, Fort Shandaken, as well as the wider revolution in. At first, I was playing with the title of the southeastern Catskills and then saying the eastern Catskills, and quickly it really became the story of the revolution in the Catskills. And when I say that, Liz said it so well too, that the topic might not be what you expect in how we talk about the topic. It's not necessarily going to be a presentation, or it won't be, where I start with, okay, the fort is built, and then I tell you about all of the riveting events and battles that took place at Fort Shandaken. It's quite the opposite, actually. You have a chaotic scene here in northwest Ulster County, on what they called the western frontier of New York State at that point, of Ulster County. And after years of really brutal fighting, it takes place in this area, really from 1770, it kind of ramps up in 76 and 77, but really from 1778 through to 1779, 2 years of brutal fighting in the area. It leads to the construction of Fort Shandaken, which really almost acts as a deterrent, a staging point from which attacks are levied elsewhere, but never the spot of a large battle. The fort is effective in that way. And so to just give first a shout out to the sources I'll be using for this presentation, a lot of what I'll be talking about today is based on recent research that was done by a local historian who many of you are likely familiar with, named Justin Wexler. He is publishing right now a series of blog posts through the Hudson River Maritime Museum, tracing the Esopus people, the native people of southern Ulster County in the American Revolution. And the story of Fort Shandaken, the story of the revolution in the Catskills, is also the story of the Esopus people in their revolution. And so he's done incredible research publishing that in the last few months, and I encourage you to check those out on the Maritime Museum website. And I've also supplemented those with my own research as well. As historians, our favorite thing, or the thing we require, are citations. Because, history isn't so much how it's taught to us in schools oftentimes as facts and dates and names. It's more the why questions, the how questions. Historians can examine the same event an unlimited number of times because how we interpret that event can change over time. And so what you do as a historian when you read another historian's work is you look at their interpretation, but then you go to their citation to see what primary source they looked at. And you look at that primary source and you say, well, yeah, I agree with their interpretation. And then you cite the historian whose work you read, or you say, I don't really agree with their interpretation. I am going to interpret it otherwise. And so I've done that. I've, looked at the sources that Justin has cited, almost all of which I interpret the same way, but I've added on some of my own findings to that as well. And so those primary sources are, oh, sorry, I don't know what happened there. Let me see if I can get this fixed quick. How long was that going for? And none of you told me. No worries. Okay, so that's now my computer's frozen. There we go. Okay, cool. So it's mostly the published papers of New York's wartime governor, also Ulster County's clerk, also the commander of the Continental Army lines that are here in the Hudson Valley, and also the leader of the Ulster, Westchester, and Dutchess County militias, and also a future Vice President, George Clinton. So his published papers I'll be citing for the most part today. And it's his published papers because part of the reason we know so little about Fort Shandaken and why even after this presentation there's going to be a lot of unanswered questions is because almost all of the original records of Fort Shandaken and most of the records of Ulster County in the Revolution do not survive today. Does anyone have a guess and know what happened to him? Some of them. Burning Kingston's a fantastic guess, actually, but no. Thankfully, our deputy county clerk at the time evacuated all of the records. Really, his wife did it, actually. We should give Cornelia Tappan some credit. Cornelia Tappan evacuated almost all of the archival records from Kingston out of Kingston before the city was burned. They were hid down in Rochester. And we in the county clerk's office have those records to this day because of her bravery. It was actually a fire that happened in Albany in 1912, where the New York State Library burned, and with it went tens, if not hundreds of thousands of New York's historic records. But thankfully for us, the papers of George Clinton had been published before that fire took place. And I will show you a few images of transcripts of those published papers today so that you can see what some of those sources look like. So just to give an overview of the basic facts I'll be covering today. After a 100-year period of peace between the Esopus people and the Catskill Mohicans, the two native groups of Ulster County, and Ulster County itself, the American Revolution fractures an alliance that had been in place for a century. The Esopus, the Catskill Mohicans, they choose the British side, and Ulster County, of course, chooses the side of independence in the Revolution. And with that alliance being broken, a Western theater of the American Revolution opens up in Ulster County. And while most of the public history focus today, a lot of the historians' focus in the past has been on the burning of Kingston and the battles of Forts Clinton and Montgomery in the eastern side of Ulster County, I'm here today to tell you that I'd argue even more pivotal, but don't tell my boss I said that. The more pivotal events, and certainly in terms of just quantity, most of the fighting of the American Revolution in Ulster County takes place in this area. It takes place on the western frontier of the county, between those two sides I just mentioned. As well, I should mention the Catskill Mohicans and Esopus are fighting alongside loyalists from all over Ulster County that flee to the Catskills when this alliance is broken, as well as Haudenosaunee allies. And of course, the militia from Ulster County is stationed here in Shandaken. It's stationed up and down the western frontier of Ulster County, both to defend Ulster County, but also to launch our own attacks into the Catskills against these loyalists, against these British-aligned native communities. And so Fort Shandaken is one of several forts built to defend Ulster County from attacks by these British-aligned native people, by loyalists in the Catskill Mountains. And it's not the site of a battle, but rather a staging point for raids to the west. And that's the case before the fort's ever built. It's a site actually where troops had been stationed. It was a meeting point, a staging point for larger raids for years before the fort is built there in May of 1779. And so that's when the fort is constructed. And after the fort is built, it's quite effective as a deterrent. No large armies come through that valley and attack Kingston or Marbletown or the more settled parts of Ulster County. Really, no small raiding parties really come to this area of the county after the fort is constructed. Those raids from the British-aligned loyalists and native people shift further north to Saugerties and further to our south in the Rondout Valley. So it's quite an effective fort. It does its job. And that said, we already talked about this a bit before we started, but we don't know the exact location of the fort today. The closest thing we know is where this historic marker is. We know it was somewhere in that flat valley just south of Mount Tremper. Somewhere near that sign on the side of Route 28, near the site of Migliorelli farm stand today. And to give a sense of why this is all, or what happens kind of throughout the war in terms of the Western theater, the Esopus people, their villages, get pushed by raids from the Ulster County militia further and further northwest until eventually, while the Esopus warriors are still in the Catskills fighting, their women and children, their non-combatants, move up into the Mohawk Valley in the Finger Lakes region for safety. They move there to escape raids by our soldiers and to come under the protection of the Haudenosaunee. And it does actually the opposite. They're living there in 1779 when a very famous campaign by the Continental Army comes through the Mohawk Valley. It's called the Sullivan and Clinton campaigns. And that campaign is meant to destroy the ability of British-aligned Native people in New York to wage war against the Patriots. It is meant to burn every Native home, every Native village, every Native farm that they can find, and it does. Over 40 villages and farms are burned. And to this day, in the Haudenosaunee language, George Washington's name is Town Burner. To this very day. And so the Esopus are there when these raids take place. And that forces the Esopus people and their descendants over the border into what's now Ontario, Canada. And while raids continue to take place in Ulster County, they're coming all the way down from Niagara to attack the area in 1780 and 1781. It's really that campaign that removes the Esopus people from New York. And after the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, with Fort Shandaken here deterring any raids from specifically coming through this area, the Esopus people with their Haudenosaunee allies are given land in Ontario, Canada, and they remain there to this day. There's a community there called called the Six Nations of the Grand River, a Haudenosaunee reservation, and on that reservation there is a subgroup known as the Delaware of the Six Nations of the Grand River. So you have the six Haudenosaunee nations and then the Delaware of the Six Nations, and those are the native people of Ulster County. They almost en masse move to Ontario at the end of the war. And that all sets the stage for the establishment of the town of Woodstock. And it's from the town of Woodstock that Shandaken is broken off and founded in 1804, with its many hamlets within settled shortly afterward. So today's presentation isn't the history of Shandaken's founding per se, but rather the process and the revolution that makes the establishment of large settlements here possible. It's really possible because of this war, and for better or worse, of course. Better maybe for those settlers, worse, of course, for the Esopus people. It's their removal from the land that sets the stage for this area to be settled, largely. And so to jump right into it, and this is where I ask for all of your patience because we're going to cover some context you all have heard before. I mean, the story of Fort Shandaken, as I said, is the story of the Western theater of the American Revolution in Ulster County. And that's the story of relations, diplomacy between Ulster County and its native inhabitants. And so to tell this story, we need context of who those native inhabitants are and what leads to the breakdown of the century-old alliance between the Esopus and Ulster County that's in place at the start of the American Revolution. So who are the native inhabitants of Ulster County? I know someone in this room knows, so I'm going to challenge you a little bit. Who are the native residents of Ulster County? I've said the name already a couple of times. Yeah, cool. I was hoping someone would say that because I've only said Esopus so far. So they are Lenape speakers, and Lenape is really a language. It's part of a larger language family called the Eastern Algonquian language family, which develops, and this is always where I have to hold myself back because I could talk about this for hours. It develops in the northwestern part of the United States, actually in the Columbia River Plateau, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, some 10,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago. And over thousands of years afterward, after that language is formed in the Columbia River Plateau in what's now like Washington State area, their descendants slowly over thousands of years move east. And as they go east, groups remain behind along the way. And those groups form their own branches of this language family. And somewhere in the last 4,000 or 5,000 years, we're not entirely sure when, a group comes as these Algonquian speakers move further east, a group moves south from the Great Lakes region and settles here in New York. And that branch of the Algonquian language family is known as Lenape because that was how they identified themselves. Lenape in their language just means human being. So imagine the first Dutch, and I always say this, but imagine the first Dutch explorers coming here, Henry Hudson coming up the river in 1609. He meets them, he says to them, "Who are you?" And they say, "I don't know, we're people." We're not, right? And we call them people to this day. And Lenni Lenape, how many of you guys have heard that term? Lenni Lenape? Yeah, so that just means original people. That was their word for themselves. Because if Lenape means people, that means that we're, in their language, we're Lenape. And so they had another word that went before Lenape that meant white. They had another word that went before Lenape that meant black. And then they are the Lenni Lenape, the original Lenape, the original people. And of course, within the Lenape, there are different dialects spoken. So this is a map taken from one of my favorite scholars of Native history, a man named Tom Arne Mittrod. And this map shows us all the Native groups living in the Hudson Valley. But really, Lenape homeland stretched from the Housatonic River Valley in Connecticut, about north to what's now Albany, and west through the Delaware River Valley and the upper Susquehanna River Valley as well. So into Pennsylvania, New Jersey, parts of upper Delaware as well. And there are three large dialects of Lenape spoken. We refer to them today as, this is the dialect I know you've all heard of, Mohican or Mohican. And that's spoken primarily on the eastern side of the Hudson River, so the Housatonic River Valley, the east side of the river here, so the Wappingers people, for instance, they spoke Mohican. Of course, the Mohican people themselves up around Albany, and the Catskill Indians are also sometimes called the Catskill Mohicans. So the people residing primarily in what's now Greene County, they were Mohican speakers. Whereas the dialect spoken here on the west side of the Hudson Valley, down through what's now New York City, the western part of Long Island, parts of northern New Jersey, and the Delaware River Valley especially, that is a dialect called, I know someone knows it. I heard someone say it. Someone say it quietly. It's Muncie. That's a great guess. So the Ramapo would be a subgroup that are living down in the Ramapo Valley, much like the Esopus are a subgroup. So Muncie is the dialect spoken in our region. But I'm glad you mentioned the Ramapo. You would even not identify necessarily based on what dialect you spoke, you'd identify based on where you lived. And so they would have specific names to themselves depending on what land they lived on, even though all of these different Lenape-speaking groups knew they were related to one another, they allied with one another, they intermarried with one another. And so there were people living in what's now, the area we call Ramapo, because that's what they called it. And the subgroup that lived here in Ulster County, from the, kind of the border, really close to the border of Ulster and Greene County, south about to what's now the city of Newburgh. It's kind of remarkable how much the Esopus boundaries mirror Ulster County's boundaries today. They're known as the Esopus people. And the Esopus people, and I should mention too, just because I named the other two dialects, the third dialect spoken further down in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Delaware, that's called Unami. And just to quickly mention where their descendants end up today, the Lenape communities today mirror these dialect differences. The Mohican speakers mostly, not entirely, they all kind of amalgamate somewhat, but Mohican speakers primarily end up in Wisconsin. They're part of a community today called the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohican Indians. The Munsee speakers end up in Ontario. They are the Munsee Delaware Nation, the Delaware Nation at Moraviantown, and our Delaware of the Six Nations I mentioned. And then the Unami speakers primarily end up in Oklahoma. And whereas it's a different story in terms of how the Unami speakers end up in Oklahoma, and thank you, Brett, and how the Mohican speakers end up in Wisconsin, the Munsee speakers from this area end up in Ontario, as I said, directly by way of the American Revolution. And I'm not going to go too much into their way of life, except to say the Esopus daily life was really built around the environment here. They saw themselves as one part of an interconnected environment. And their daily life would have changed with the seasons, built around what the land could provide for them. And so with their way of life built around this land, colonization greatly disrupts their way of life. I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this painting on the right here. Many of you are familiar with this painting, or who did this painting at the least. This is a painting done by the historical painter Len Tantillo, who does fantastically accurate depictions of historic scenes based on primary sources and archaeological research. This is a depiction of Kingston, the Stockade District, or Uptown Kingston, circa 1685, but it's close enough for our purposes, even though I'm talking a bit earlier. So Dutch colonization in New York really begins not in the Hudson Valley, and not even in New York City, maybe surprisingly. That's where the earliest, the earliest person to kind of, camp through the winter is in the New York City area. But the first settlement, really, the first town formed in colonization is Albany today. Because the motive for Dutch colonization was trade with native people for furs, which were very valuable in Europe at this point. And establishing yourself in Albany meant not only can you trade with all the Lenape folks south of Albany along the Hudson, but you have access to the Mohawk River to trade with all of the Haudenosaunee folks, the other large language group in New York as well. And I should have mentioned that if you go just beyond Albany further north, or go just beyond the Catskill Mountains to our northwest, you're getting out of Lenape territory. You're getting into territory instead of the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois of the Six Nations. And I always like to mention those two groups, their languages are as different from one another as they are different from English. Entirely unrelated people, actually enemies for many thousands of years until colonization, there's a great motive to make two native groups that had fought get along for the first time. Colonization's a great one. Not always, but at times. And so settlement doesn't really come to the Hudson Valley until some 30 years after colonization begins in Albany and New York City in the 1620s. And that arrives here with one or two people settled in Catskill in the late 1640s. I have to admit that because my coworker John Palmer, our Ulster County archivist and Greene County historian, will yell at me if I don't mention that they came first. But the first town really founded in the Hudson Valley is what we call Kingston today. And it's settled in 1652, known first as Esopus or Wiltwyck. And again, we have a fantastic depiction of what that site looked like here. And with that onset of colonization, with the establishment of Kingston, of course, you don't just have Europeans arriving here, and not just Dutch colonists, I should mention, but extremely diverse groups of Europeans. The Dutch are allowing anyone who wants to come here and build a new life, and will follow their laws, of course, to settle here. And so that means Dutch people, yes, but that means French people and German people and English people and Spanish people and Jewish individuals from many different countries. There's an Islamic man from North Africa we know who settles here in the 1630s, before any of my ancestors are here. So you have an incredibly diverse European population, colonial population, and of course they bring enslaved people as well. First enslaved people arrived to New York City in 1627. We don't know exactly when the first African resident comes to the Hudson Valley, but we have a record of a person being enslaved by Thomas Chambers, who's the first European man to live in Kingston. He's the first person to settle there in 1652. So chances are, from the time the first white person stepped foot on this land and lived here permanently, there was a black man alongside him, likely right next to Thomas Chambers. And so diverse enslaved people arrive here as well. I'm going to just jump ahead a little bit. And so settlement at Wiltwyck greatly disrupts the Esopus way of life. And yet the Esopus give permission for them to settle there, probably because they've heard from their cousins up in Albany and down in New York City that resisting and having a violent conflict doesn't lead to good results for either side. But maybe also they're just inclined to allow these newcomers in to try and coexist. We don't know at the end of the day, but they do try and coexist, and I commend them for that. And yet tension rises. Tension rises due to environmental degradation. Their way of life is built on the environment. You disrupt that environment, it disrupts their way of life. Disease, of course, takes its toll on their population. There are cultural misunderstandings. You have European livestock that are grazing through Native American crop fields and cornfields. Europeans are trading alcohol to Native people despite the fact that that's made illegal, and despite the fact that Native leaders are pleading to the European leaders to stop that trade from happening. And of course, we all know alcohol can lead to antisocial behavior when consumed in excess. And so these various tensions eventually do lead to the outbreak of violent conflict here. In 1659, the first of two wars breaks out. And I should mention, actually, that rising tensions first lead to... Oh, I gotta go back one, sorry. First lead to the founding of the Stockade District. Sorry, it's like on a 1 second delay. It'll go back. There it goes. So at first, actually, the earliest settlers are scattered along the Esopus Creek down below what's now the Stockade District. But because of these rising tensions, in 1657, 1658, Governor Peter Stuyvesant orders the residents of Kingston to relocate and build a stockade wall on raised ground above the Esopus Creek. And that's what we now call Kingston's Uptown or Stockade District. And so the first of two conflicts breaks out there in 1659. That one's just purely over cultural misunderstanding. There's a brief siege of the Stockade District, but they hold out. And that war, when it ends, it's an uneasy peace. There are Native people, Esopus warriors, that are taken into captivity and are actually sent into enslavement in Curacao. And while they do return, that's seen by the Europeans as being like a deterrent, right? Like, we're taking hostages to show you what will happen if we fight a conflict again. It does the opposite. It's hard to get over a conflict when you're still wondering where your brothers are, where you're still wondering where your father is, and you know they're enslaved in a Caribbean island. And so maybe unsurprisingly, a second conflict breaks out in 1659. And this is 1663. And the Second Esopus War is a really, really brutal conflict. You have both sides taking women and children, non-combatants captive. You have both sides trying to destroy each other's homes and crop fields ahead of the winter to try and starve each other out. It's a brutal war on both sides. And at the end of that war, something incredible happens. Both sides, I think, probably knew that they were lucky to make it out of that conflict intact. And so they don't just say, we're not going to fight anymore. They sign in 1665, right about the time the English take over, the treaty that you can see on both sides of the screen here. This is what's called the Nichols Treaty. And this is not just a ceasefire. This is a commitment to turn this relationship full 180 from a adversarial relationship to an alliance. These two groups that have just fought for 4 years, these two groups that have, really devastating conflicts they've waged against one another, commit themselves to supporting one another, to living peacefully, coexisting in perpetuity. They don't just sign this peace treaty and kind of wipe their hands of it. They say every single year, we're going to renew this. And when you renew it, you're going to bring the young people from both communities to it so that they learn the importance of this. And so that when none of us are here anymore, they can carry that legacy forward. And we have dozens of these treaty renewals preserved in the Ulster County archives to this day. At various renewals, they present wampum belts to the Ulster County government. And unfortunately, only one of them survives, the one given in 1678. But this wampum belt, you can see the original there and some zoomed in images of reproduction beads that you can see what they would have looked like originally in all their beauty. This wampum belt, and how many of you know what wampum is? Okay, cool. So I'll give a little rundown. Yeah. So wampum are beads that are made of quahog shells, and they are sacred to many Native communities. And in many Native communities, but especially in Lenape communities, they are used somewhat akin to what we call currency. They're a trade item, but more so in these. So if they're on a string or just in kind of, piles, they'd be a currency. But in belts like this, they would be woven into designs that have great symbolic meaning. It's almost like a mnemonic tool. They didn't have a written language, and yet their oral histories remain remarkably intact over thousands of years. This is how. So imagine this wampum belt, and we know that this design, 3 parallel dark, and there would have been intact lines there, 3 parallel diagonal lines on a white background. That is a prototypical design that would be given from Munsee people, Munsee speakers, to another community to symbolize a sibling-like alliance between their communities. We have one other surviving example at the William Penn Museum, and that's one given to William Penn for the exact same reason by speakers of the Munsee language as well. And so this is a belt given to us to symbolize this sibling-like relationship that these two communities have. And again, I think that's an incredible thing. These are people that know one another. They know one another by name, right? They would have been trading for years, living alongside one another before these wars break out. When these wars break out, they're relatively small communities. It's not just a vague, the native warriors came in. You know the name of the person that might have burnt your house. You know the name, either the native people knowing the name of the European or vice versa, of the person that could have killed or taken captive someone from your family. And so the fact that they can turn around and they can sincerely commit themselves to peace, I think is incredible. And it lasts. It lasts over 100 years, from 1665 to 1776. This peace is in place. And just to kind of circle back, a bit of a callback, I referenced before that we don't know when the first African American or African arrives to the Hudson Valley, but we know that there was an enslavement owned by the first founder of Kingston, Thomas Chambers. The reason we know of that enslavement but don't know when he arrived is actually because of the casualty list from the Second Esopus War. The first reference to a Black person in Ulster County is a casualty. We don't get his name. It just says the Negro man of Thomas Chambers, who was killed in the Second Esopus War. And I always like to pay homage to that man, of course. And so, although you have peace, you don't have an end to the process of colonization. And over the course, so these are 2 maps here. The map on the right is really showing you the boundaries of Ulster County in this time period. I always like to show this for geographic context. So you can see the southern boundary went much further south than it goes today. So it included Montgomery. It also included Newburgh and New Windsor. Those weren't cut off and given to Orange County until after the Revolution, and that's a separate story. If anyone's interested, you can ask about that in the Q&A. But the northern boundary was pretty similar. The northern boundary stays put for the most part, but the western boundary is far different. Basically, Sullivan County was Ulster County at that point, and that's the kind of quick summary of the geography. But here on the left side, I wanted to show this map because this is a map that really shows us the native inhabited areas of New York at the time of the Revolution. So you'll see Kingston is in the lower right here. And then the Catskill Mountains are kind of weirdly, portrayed by that kind of C shape or half moon shape design there. And then you have the upper branches of the Delaware River, the upper branches of the Susquehanna River, and the Haudenosaunee homelands there as well. So this would really be the frontier, the Catskill Mountains, and that's what this map is showing us. The Catskill Mountains as the frontier of Ulster County. And I show that map because even though they're allied, over this 100-year period when this alliance is in place, the Esopus are slowly pushed to that area. They sell almost all of their homelands in Ulster County in over 60 land deeds between 1660 and 1760. And this is my interpretation, this is my argument. But I would argue that that's not necessarily, that can't be purely understood through them being victimized by Europeans swindling them for land. Partially, that is what happens. But I'd also argue it's a bit of a strategy by the Esopus people. And I'll use my kind of home area of New Paltz as an example, because New Paltz is one of the first areas sold after the Esopus Wars. So imagine this Esopus community is devastated by this war. You've lost a ton of population. You've lost a ton of your food stores and your clothing and provisions. You've lost your home. Let's say hypothetically that the family that lived in New Paltz, the Esopus family, had lost more casualties in the war than the family living on the other side of the mountain in what's now Kerhonkson. Well, if that family in New Paltz sells their land to the Europeans, who are going to keep demanding land. The difference between the Esopus and the Europeans is that there's a whole lot more Europeans over in Ocean, so you kill a bunch in the Esopus War, and they're going to keep coming. There's not more Esopus living over a waterway somewhere that are going to come and replace them. And so the European land demand, it keeps increasing. So maybe if you sell that land to New Paltz, where there are fewer people remaining anyway, hypothetically, not only do you satiate the European demand for land for a little bit, but you get a ton of goods back in compensation for that land. Not always, as I said before, sometimes it is the case where Native people are misled and exploited, and they're given very little for their land, or they are directly lied to in these land agreements. But in other cases like New Paltz, they're given a great deal. I mean, horses, muskets, ammunition, linen clothing, raw materials like bars of lead and iron. They're given wampum and European currency. They're given linen clothing. They're given blankets. They're given pots and pans. They're given tools like axes and adzes. I mean, it's an immense amount of goods that keep them sustained in the aftermath of this devastating war. And so, I think we should maybe look at this as strategy. Them trying to resist colonization, and they do resist attempts by Europeans to get them to sell all their land at once, and they instead slowly sell it off. And as they sell it off, they slowly move west of the Catskill Mountains into the upper branches of the Delaware River. And that's where their villages are. They never really lived in the Catskill Mountains. Further to the north, the Catskill Mohicans would live in certain valleys there. Justin Wexler actually talks about this on the Catscast. He gives a great summary of this, that they are using that as hunting grounds, really. There are hunting camps that would be used seasonally in the Catskill Mountains, but their homes moved to the upper branches of the Delaware River. And yet they're coming back to Ulster County that whole time. They still use their rights to hunt through these lands, which they retain in a lot of land agreements, like New Paltz. They had the right to return there and hunt whenever they wanted. They returned to trade. And you can imagine after a generation or two, these people are friends. They know each other on a first name basis. They work for each other even. We have account books showing Native people working on European farms and vice versa. Sometimes they get so close that Native people get known by nicknames that are based on what Europeans they were close with. And so it's not just an alliance, this is a friendship between these communities at the same time that a exploitative process of colonization is taking place, which I know is maybe contradictory and nuanced, but history is always kind of messy like that. And so by the time of the Revolution, that's where they are. They are in the upper branches of the Delaware River, but still coming back down to Ulster County. And as these lands are slowly sold, Ulster County expands. You have towns spread outward from Kingston, down the Wallkill River Valley, down the Rondout River Valley, and a little bit north as well. You have Saugerties. You get, Marbletown to the southwest of Kingston. Some early settlers near Woodstock. And of course, with this expansion of Europeans, you also get expansion of enslavement as well. And yet, maybe surprisingly, not a whole lot of people end up here. And there's two reasons for that. I was going to ask if anyone had a guess, but actually this kind of gives it away, I think, for many of you. So Shandaken really remains an area largely devoid of European settlement up to the time of the American Revolution. There are some scattered settlers throughout the entire area, but we're really talking a handful. And there's two reasons for that. One reason is I think likely due in part to just the topography of the area. If you're going to settle in if you're going to settle somewhere in an agricultural economy, a fertile river valley like the Rondout or the Wallkill River valleys might be, I think, a bit more desirable. Although Mount Tremper, I think, is a great example of a fertile river valley that exists here in the Catskill Mountains. But largely, it's not so much the topography as it is the Hardenberg patent. Dun dun dun. How many of you have heard of the Hardenberg patent before? Cool. Okay, so not everyone then. I'll give a quick summary. People can and have given hour-long presentations on that patent. So the quick summary is in 1706, Johannes Hardenberg, a very prominent kind of gentry leader of Ulster County, I'll call him, purchases an immense tract of land in the Catskill Mountains. This is an example of one of the land agreements that is exploitative and is kind of swindling the native population. 2 million acres. 2 million acres of the Catskill Mountains are sold. And he gets permission from just one or two Esopus people. Esopus people had a concept of land ownership, but it was a shared concept of land ownership. The New Paltz Land Agreement gets signed by some 25 people that all co-owned the land in theory. Having 2 people sign off for 2 million acres, they didn't have the right to sign that off. And further, they are given, I forget the exact sum, I had it written down somewhere, they're given some 60 pounds. Only 60 pounds for those 2 million acres. And that covered most of the Catskill Mountains in Ulster County, much of Sullivan County, and parts of Delaware County as well. And so, being that the Esopus didn't have permission to sell the land, the Esopus people that signed that land agreement, and the compensation was a measly sum, the patent was confirmed by the British government in 1708, but there are constant disputes as to whether that was legal or not. And not only constant disputes, it's such a large bit of land that dividing it becomes an insanely complicated affair. And so because shares in the patent change hands frequently, because there are constant legal challenges to this patent, it really impedes settlement of that patent for a very long time, for some 70 years after the patent's issued. And they aren't fully starting to work through those ownership issues to then allow for settlement here until the 1770s, which I know kind of it feels like fate, right, to some degree. That just about the time of the Revolution, you start to get some of the first small landowners that get subdivided parts of the Hardenberg patent that end up moving up to places like Shandaken. And so because of that little settlement until the 18th century, but you have early individuals here in the 1770s. And there's another reason why you get people just starting to reside here in the 1770s. The British government prior to the 1770s is trying to limit European expansion into native homelands. This comes after the 1750s. This comes after the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. The British government is already in deep debt. We all know the story. We all heard this in elementary school. We all see this in all the classic Revolutionary War depictions. The British government's in debt after the French and Indian War. They can't afford a war with native people. They can't afford much of anything. And so one thing they do is they start taxing us. How dare they? They start taxing us to cover that war debt, but they also try and limit the expansion of European colonists onto the lands acquired in the French and Indian War. They're trying to limit westward expansion into native homelands to prevent further war with native people. And that's the case here. However, in 1763, you all learned about this in elementary school, even if you don't remember, the Proclamation of 1763 forbids expansion west of the Appalachian Mountains. In 1768, we have the equivalent in New York. There's a treaty called the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. And I'm going to go back one slide and zoom in on this map I showed before, the frontier. So the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768 is a good example of how the Esopus people, throughout colonization, they ally with the Haudenosaunee, but they're really treated as subservient to the Haudenosaunee oftentimes. This is a prime example of that. This is a treaty negotiated with the Haudenosaunee, where the Haudenosaunee negotiate a line to be drawn beyond which Europeans are not allowed to expand, and that's this dotted line. Which is fine and great for the Haudenosaunee, right? Because your homes are all up here. And so you're fine. But remember where I said the Esopus people had been pushed in that 100-year period where they're selling their land? They're pushed here, just inside that line. Meaning that proclamation gives a stamp of legal approval to Europeans from Ulster County to start pouring through the Catskill Mountains. They start coming to Shandaken. They start pouring across the Catskills. And yet, few of them will be there just a couple short years later because of the outbreak of fighting in the American Revolution. And so with these settlers now pouring into their homelands, you have tensions begin to rise between the Essobas people and between the Ulster County government once again. After 100 years of peace, tensions start to rise. And as those tensions rise, the Haudenosaunee people are pushed, the Essobas people are pushed closer with the Haudenosaunee people. They're also pushed into closer relations with the British as well, who are allied with the Haudenosaunee. I mean, they see themselves as being, which is kind of funny because the Treaty of Fort Shandaken is signed by the British, but they see this more as the responsibility of the individual colonists from Ulster County that are pouring into their homelands. And they look to the British to the northwest, and as the British and the American colonists start to divide, they start to see the British more as their allies, or at the very least, the people that can lead to a better outcome for their communities. And at the same time that they're being pushed towards the British, Ulster County is moving further and further toward independence. Ulster County is, in the view of many prominent historians in our area, people like Thomas Weremuth at the Hudson River Valley Institute, Kieran O'Keefe, a prominent scholar on loyalism in the Hudson Valley. It's one of the most fervently pro-independence areas of New York State. I'd argue the most fervently pro-independence area of New York State. And it's likely due to our elected leaders. Members of the gentry, so these are people with largely agricultural bases of wealth. They aren't nobility, but they're certainly wealthy people with a level of kind of inherited wealth and power. People like George Clinton here on the left, who I mentioned before. He's the guy that wears like 10 different hats during the Revolution. One of the most fascinating characters from Ulster County ever. He is born in Little Britain in what's now Newburgh, but we're going to claim him for our own because it was Ulster County at that point. And then, of course, over here on the right, we have a drawing of Colonel Charles DeWitt. If you've driven past the historic marker for DeWitt Mill at the end of DeWitt Mills Road, coming in between kind of Kingston and Rosendale on Route 32, that's the home of Charles DeWitt. And these men are both elected to the last colonial government of New York. They're prominent Whigs. And they are some of the most radical Whigs in Congress. And this is one area where what you learned in elementary school is the story, right? Britain's taxing us to pay off that war debt, and the people of Ulster County are thinking, well, we've been sacrificing for the benefit of the British imperial kind of project for generations. Every time the British have a military occupation or a military expedition and demand militia to, serve them, Ulster County residents answer the call. And that is, for instances you've heard of, like the French and Indian War, where Ulster County men lose their lives. They sacrifice their lives for the British in that war. But it's also for campaigns you've never heard of, I bet. How many of you guys have heard of the campaign to try and attack Quebec in like 1712? Yeah, exactly, right? One person, yes. Let's go. I love that. So you get men from Ulster County that lose their lives in that conflict. And then further, they want to turn and tax us without giving us representation to have a voice against those taxes when we've already paid that debt. It outrages people here. There's also, of course, the demand for land. For the people of Ulster County now having, British ownership of lands to the west that were previously French that are gained in the French and Indian War, the idea that the British government is forbidding you from moving on to those lands because they want to protect the native people, it's outrageous to many Europeans. And many Europeans see that as their right, that they earn the right to settle in those lands. And so the representatives from Ulster County in the last colonial government, I'd argue they're responsible for pushing the government of New York as a whole towards independence. I'll share just one quick quote. And of course, within all of this, you have protests and you have the, smaller tea parties take place in the Hudson Valley, even in Kingston. You have the Sons of Liberty active here. You have boycotts that are active here. But trying to think about time so we can get to the fort. Yeah, I know. Thank you. I appreciate you. So the one quote I do just want to share, though, is that George Clinton is actually one of the first people in New York to call for full independence, or at least to call for military resistance to the British. In 1775, the New York State, or the New York colonial government, rejects the provisions of the First Continental Congress. How many of you guys knew that? Yeah, New York says, no, we're not on board with this. One faction, the Tory faction, outvotes the Whig or the rebel faction by one vote. But when they outvote the Whig faction, George Clinton says the time has nearly come that the colonies must have recourse to arms, and the sooner the better. And that's one of the first times someone says those words in the colonial government here, and it causes an uproar. And so we become fervently on the side of independence. So when the war breaks out in 1775, there's no debate on what side Ulster County is going to be on. Our county government is fervently for independence. And throughout the rest of the war, not only are we providing hundreds, likely thousands of men. Oh, happened again? Let me see if I can pull it up. Not only are we having thousands of men join the Continental Army, but the militia of Ulster County functionally serves as a kind of supplement to the Continental Army. Okay, it says I'm hooked up to it, so I don't know what's happening there. All right, I'm going to keep talking for a minute while we play around with this. But so essentially, Ulster County chooses the side of independence in the American Revolution. And with that, as I mentioned already, the Hasobas are being pushed further and further towards the British side. And in 1776, they commit themselves formally to the British side in the American Revolution at Fort Niagara. Thank you. And after they commit themselves to the British side at Fort Niagara, something remarkable happens. They come back to Ulster County and they renew the Nichols Treaty one more time. All right. Okay. Plug that in there. And technology is supposed to make our lives easier, isn't it? There we go. So they renew the treaty one more time. People like Colonel Charles DeWitt actually still, despite the tension, hold out hope that the Hasobas will join the American side in the war. They partially do that because the Mohicans on the other side of the river, they fight on the American side in the Revolution. And this is a contemporary depiction we have of a Mohican soldier in the Continental Army. George Washington himself writes that they're some of the bravest soldiers in the Continental Army during the war. Oh gosh, now I bumped the HDMI cord. It should pop back up right now, though. Come on. There we go. Don't touch that. So they even go so far as to Charles DeWitt, who I just showed in the last slide. He, on his orders, sends ammunition and guns over the Catskill Mountains to the Hasobas people as a gesture of goodwill, hoping to bring them into the fold. And the Hasobas people, despite committing to the British side in 1776, they come back and they renew the Nichols Treaty one more time. Now, that treaty renewal burns in the Albany Fire, but what we do have are published in a book, the bill from that treaty renewal. So you'll see there are 6 gallons of rum sold or served at that treaty renewal. They must have been having a great time. So it says, to the following articles for the treaty held this day with the Hasobas Indians. And it mentions on top the Committee of Kingston. That is the last time ever that the Nichols Treaty would be renewed officially between these two governments. Because although they've committed to the British in 76, the Hasobas haven't actually fought on the British side yet. And then in 1777, they do fight on the British side. They fight on the British side at the Battle of Oriskany. And at the Battle of Oriskany, which also fragments the Haudenosaunee people, they fight on the side of the Haudenosaunee allied with the British, and they meet some Continental Army and some militia soldiers there in that battle. And yet, so that battle takes place in 1777. You have uneasy peace in 76. Tensions are rising, but uneasy peace. Actually, I did skip over one step I should have mentioned. As these tensions rise, even after they renew the Nichols Treaty that last time in 1776, gosh, there it goes. It's back. They can kind of see the writing on the wall. In 1776, the Hasobas people order all Patriot-aligned settlers in the Catskill Mountains to move east, to flee the Catskill Mountains. And that's partly because in 1776, although fighting hasn't broken out between the Hasobas and Ulster County, fighting's starting to break out there between Loyalist settlers and their Patriot neighbors in areas like Shandaken. Although there's only a handful of people here, the people that are moving in are starting to fight one another. And the Hasobas order all Patriot settlers to leave. And in reverse, as the government of Ulster County chooses the Patriot side, the Loyalists of Ulster County are starting to flee west up into the Catskills. So you get these two sides formed, and yet peace holds uneasily in 1776. But then they fight in that Battle of Oriskany in 1777, and after they fight that battle, they do something I think really, really remarkable. They write to George Clinton, and they say, although we're on opposite sides now, you know that, they say, we will agree not to directly attack you if you want to attack us. If we meet as part of larger coalitions or armies up in the Mohawk Valley or down near New York City, then all bets are off. And what happens, happens. But they said that's no reason for us to fracture this direct alliance. There's no reason for you to attack our homes or us to attack your homes. And we'll guard your western front if you guard our eastern front. And George Clinton writes back to them, and he says that he cannot ignore the fact that they participated in the Battle of Oriskany. He says you picked your side and you're going to deal with the consequences. And so Ulster County's government breaks that alliance. It's the culmination of a bunch of nuanced events. And with that, war comes to the Catskill Mountains. These are the sources I've been using for this presentation. First of all, just to give you an idea of how smart I am at parsing this out. I'm kidding, of course. But just to give you an idea of really how convoluted they are. And I'm going to read a couple tidbits, but first I'll just kind of give an overview of some of the aspects of the conflict that break out. So both sides began preparing for war in the spring of 1778. And as I mentioned, the rebels from the Catskills have fled east. The loyalists from Ulster County have fled west. And the Esopus even began to move their non-combatants to the western branch of the Delaware River and further north to Haudenosaunee homelands for safety. At the same time, the Ulster County militia and rangers, so Ulster County, almost like special forces that are patrolling the frontier, they began being stationed along the frontier, including on the field where that historic marker is, south of Mount Tremper. Even though there's no fort there yet, that already is a place where there's an encampment. Not continuously, but very regularly throughout 1778 and 79, and even in the late months of 77, soldiers are stationed there. And they're having horse patrols up and down the frontier to try and prevent any raids from coming down, to make sure an attack doesn't happen. I can give the date. On July 8th, 1778, the Haudenosaunee ordered the Esopus to send a notice to loyalists in Kingston, Hurley, and Marbletown, telling them to flee so as to ensure that they aren't mistaken for rebels in the coming attacks from the Esopus people. And think of what that would mean if imagine you're one of the patriots living in Marbletown or Hurley and you see that notice go out, right? You think, well, I'm not the loyalist this notice is meant for, but this tells me that these attacks are coming. July 10th, 2 days later, in 1778, 40 Esopus and loyalists raid the upper Rondout Valley, taking prisoners and livestock from the area they called Lackawack and from the town of Rochester. At the same time, the Lenape and loyalists, so not the Esopus, other Lenape groups, and loyalists raid the Minisink area around what's now Port Jervis. In response, George Clinton, in August of 1778, orders Ulster County militia companies to seize or destroy all provisions and food stores they can find on the east branch of the Delaware River. Those soldiers, maybe unsurprisingly, they're assembled in Shandaken on the site of the future Fort Shandaken, and they leave from Shandaken out to the eastern branch of the Delaware River, and they destroy huge amounts of provisions, livestock, grain that had already been harvested and stored, and they burn some 20 miles of grain fields. 20 miles they burn there. And I'll mention this is I know a traumatic topic for some, so a bit of a trigger warning here, but the Ulster County militia, there's sexual violence committed against the Esopus women in that raid as well. And again, brutality on both sides. Just to point to some areas where this is mentioned on here without touching the HDMI, of course. You can see Colonel Snyder's regiment to join those at Great Shandaken, being one company of about 50 men of Colonel Hasbrook's regiment. So talking about forming the soldiers before they head out. I'm gonna step around so I can point. It talks about the burning of the stores as well. I have destroyed and brought of all kind of provisions in that place, leaving none of the families or their effects. It talks about burning the 20 miles of stores as well. And so you can see that this expedition is being staged from Shandaken and is trying to destroy the ability of the Esopus people to wage war from the Catskill Mountains. Moving ahead, I'll talk about just a couple more. Because you can see at this point, it's just a tit for tat, but you can get a sense of the brutality of the fighting on both sides in this area and how horrifying it would be to have lived in this area during the Revolutionary War. And again, why I think it's a bit frustrating that historians have focused so much on the burning of Kingston, right? Not that that's, not a pivotal event, but it's been talked about, I think, at the expense of ignoring this history on the western side of Ulster County. So in retaliation for that expedition, the Esopus send 20 of their warriors and loyalists back down, and they raid the Rondout Valley as far south as Kerhonkson. And on their return towards the Catskills, they are pursued by a similar number of militiamen led by Lieutenant John Graham. And when in the vicinity of what's now Grahamsville, the Esopus Indian raiding party encountered the pursuing militiamen. There's fierce fighting that breaks out, forces the militiamen and the Esopus both to retreat. However, Lieutenant Graham and 2 of his men are killed and they're scalped at that fight. And you can see that referenced in this source here. These are transcribed letters. These are the reports sent back to George Clinton in the aftermath of that attack. And you can see here, just gotta find it. Mr. Graham, Robert Temple, and Adam Ambler were killed and scalped in this fray. The remainder are all safe returned. The enemy consisted, as near as I can learn, between 17 and 24. What I found that Mr. Graham's party was so small and not provided with provisions to pursue them far, I immediately ordered 5 days provisions to be made. So you can get a sense of the communications happening between the different American military commanders, which give us at least some sense of these activities taking place. So in the aftermath of that small skirmish, I mean, like the following day, September 6th of 1778, Esopus Indian war captains, 2 of them, the same one I mentioned before, John Runup, as well as another one, Benjamin Shanks, they send a remarkable letter to the militia officers in Marbletown, the militia officers that committed that expedition, burning the native crop fields and where that violence was performed, that sexual violence I mentioned. And I'll read just a quote from an excerpt from the letter they write. They write to the militia commanders in Marbletown to inform them, quote, of the conduct of the Rangers in their 2 excursions on the east branch of the Delaware River. Your old friends, the Esopus Indians, had always meant to screen your part of the county as much as possible in the present unhappy contest, as they had no particular spite at you. Your Rangers have stripped several families and not left them one cow. They have stripped the women and children of all their blankets and bedclothes and a great many of their other clothes. They're knocking women down and many more acts unbecoming of men. They're burning every bit of grain they could find on the river, for fear of the Indian having some little left, as they say may be the means of many of your own barns being destroyed. They desire me to inform you that if your Rangers come out any more to hurt the women and children, they will revenge it dreadfully on your women and children, and will spare none, though they never meant to hurt them. In regard of prisoners that are or may be taken, they desire to inform you that if you hang or put to death any of them, that they will burn every prisoner they get in their old barbarous manner. You can get a sense of just how devastating this conflict is, but also of the tone of regret, I think, is tragic as well. And that letter is published on that right side there. Indians threatening retaliation is the heading, which I find kind of interesting cataloging way to note it. And so these attacks continue. In September of 1678, a group of 24 militiamen stumble upon an encampment of Esopus warriors on the east branch of the Delaware near Downsville. The warriors, however, knew of the militia's approach and they ambushed them. The 2 sides fought in a dense hemlock forest on a nearby mountainside until nightfall, when both sides retreated. However, 4 or 5 died on both sides. And again, this is an area where I encourage you to check out Justin Wexler's blog post on the Hudson River Maritime Museum. I'm directly using his research in this section. And so by the end of September 1678, Governor Clinton had planned an invasion for the other side of the Catskills, with the express aim of sending militiamen and the Continental Army soldiers, a small contingent, to destroy the villages of the Esopus Indians on the west branch of the Delaware, and to try and attack the Haudenosaunee kind of staging ground for these raids, which was a town called Onondaga. And so that October, a large rebel invasion force sets out from the Schoharie Valley and heads towards the upper Susquehanna River. Under Lieutenant Colonel William Butler, this force destroys that staging town of the Haudenosaunee Onondaga, as well as the town of Unadilla. And those are towns where some of the Esopus non-combatants had been sent for their protection when fighting breaks out here a year or 2 earlier that I mentioned. And so, although some Lenape villages, including the Esopus villages on the west branch of the Delaware, have survived all this fighting, their homes on the east branch of the Delaware are entirely destroyed by the end of 1778. The towns where they've taken refuge with the Haudenosaunee, with the Mohawk to their north, are also destroyed by the end of 1778. Their women and children, many of them, their non-combatants, are now homeless, and they are surrounded by destruction. They have lost their prime agricultural lands on the east branch of the Delaware River. They've lost their staging ground of operations, and this forces them to move even further west. They move further west. I show the same frontier map again, because they move to the towns of Ostaningo and I'm awful with the native pronunciation, so you'll forgive me. But they move to 2 Haudenosaunee communities close to what's now Binghamton, New York. And those 2 communities are actually labeled just down here on the Susquehanna River there. And so with that, the Esopus people have been fully removed from their homelands. That's the last step. And although fighting continues, that's what fully removes them. And also, at the end of 1778, George Washington and George Clinton have had enough of this. They're trying to figure out methods to prevent this from happening. They've already stationed soldiers here pretty much year-round south of what's now Mount Tremper in those fields. They have soldiers stationed at a few other strategic points, a point in Kerhonkson, a point in Shangum as well, a point in Mamakating. And at the start of 1779, George Clinton orders a series of blockhouses to be constructed up and down this frontier. But before I mentioned that the Esopus are forced up into the Haudenosaunee homelands. That's going to prove extremely tragic for them. And we're going to return to that. But even though they get pushed further and further west, they're still coming back down, and these raids aren't stopping. It's remarkable how far they're traveling for these raids. And it's in the start of 1779 that they start to be used a bit differently. The Esopus start to be used, being how well they know this landscape, as almost like the special forces soldiers of the British side in the war. So, for example, and this is, I think, something fascinating. In the spring of 1779, a small number, 2 Esopus warriors are sent down here. And some of the things we see them doing are stealing newspapers. Yeah, they steal Ulster County newspapers to bring back for intelligence. They're on top of Overlook Mountain, watching the troop movements down below them. They called Woodstock then Little Shandaken. That was another point, which you guys can brag to Woodstock people about that. Just like I do to the folks in Highland about Highland being New Paltz Landing originally. So he's watching the troop movements down there. They're reporting that back to the British. On May 4th, they lead a violent raid at Fanteenkill, what's now Ellenville, where several houses are burned down and 6 individuals are killed. You can visit their grave marker and memorial today. I highly encourage you to. It's just outside the town of Ellenville. 2 weeks later, Governor Clinton is informed that a large Loyalist and Indian party, likely the same one, was in the environs of Shandaken. So they're coming back north from those raids, passing through this area. But we don't know exactly where they are. That's a very vague mention we have. That's a good example of where we wish we had more sources surviving. But because of this continued fighting, Ulster County builds these series of blockhouses. And in this context, early in 1779, Governor George Clinton orders a wooden fortification to be established at Shandaken. And as I've mentioned a few times, we no longer know the exact location. We do know it was constructed of logs and that it was completed in May of 1779 under the command of Colonel Levi Pauling. You can see that referenced here. So this is a letter from George Clinton here. And he says, orders a group to rendezvous at the East Branch of the Delaware. And then he says, those of Ulster and Dutchess rendezvous at Mamakating, Shandaken, and Lackawack, at the 2 latter of which places there are posts ordered to be established. Below you can see the fort at Shandaken. So this is a letter from Levi Pauling from the Ulster County Militia to George Clinton. He says, the fort at Shandaken is done. And then in parentheses, I heard yesterday, which I think is kind of funny too. Yeah, it's relatable in a way. Like it's remarkable how human these letters are. He says, but by the means of the late heavy rain, little has been done at Lackawack. So they've finished building Fort Shandaken at that point, but heavy rain in Lackawack, they couldn't build that one. And again, although we don't know exactly what they looked like, although we don't know exactly where it was, it's very likely these weren't forts in the sense of Forts Clinton and Montgomery or West Point. Not large palisaded forts, but rather likely blockhouses. Wooden buildings built with extremely thick walls and tiny windows, if any, so that you can take refuge in there. You can store provisions in there. And this is not so much meant to be a site that they can directly defend against attack from. It's more meant to be a site that is, in one sense, acting as a deterrent. Not a deterrent against these small raiding parties necessarily. They're going, part of the reason these raiding parties are small, part of the reason they're used as kind of special forces soldiers is they can travel kind of more clandestinely. But it's to prevent a large army. It's to prevent a force of thousands of loyalists and Haudenosaunee and Esopus soldiers from coming down this valley and attacking Kingston, attacking those towns to the east in Ulster County. It's also meant to serve as a place to store provisions and to stage further raids on our part out into the Catskills against the Esopus as well. And we can see that it's effective. We can see it's effective because from this point, there are no further raids in this area, actually. The rest of the raids that happen take place either to our north or to our south. And just as we get to our conclusion, I apologize, I know I'm a few minutes over. So in the summer of 1779, I mentioned already that the Esopus have been pushed all the way up into the Haudenosaunee homelands in the Finger Lakes region. Well, they're there when, as I mentioned earlier, George Washington orders 3 armies of the Continental Line to proceed into the Mohawk Valley, into the Finger Lakes region. You can see their routes in this map on the right. And to burn every native crop field they can find, every native home they can find. They burn over 40 native villages, towns, crop fields. And it's there that the Esopus were given land as they had been pushed out of their homelands. And so with that, the Esopus become refugees. And alongside the Haudenosaunee, they're forced to flee to Fort Niagara for protection. And they get there just in time for one of the coldest winters in the 18th century here. And so, unfortunately, many do not survive the winter of 1779 to 1780, but thankfully most do. And I'll use the exact words of Justin Wexler here. He says the British Indian Department's ability to feed and shelter so many refugees of so many nations is nothing short of miraculous. And thank God that that happened. Their descendants survive today because of that. And so the Esopus remain in that region in terms of where their non-combatants are living, just outside of that fort in far western New York. They're farming in the aftermath, and yet they're preparing for revenge, and they're still coming back down here. So I haven't found evidence of further engagements in this specific region, likely again due to Fort Shandaken, the fort acting as a deterrent against further violence in this localized area. However, retaliatory raids by the Esopus and their allies gain intensity and take place in other areas of Ulster County. For example, Warsing is raided in both 1780 and 1781. And there is one further raid that is relevant to Shandaken. I mentioned already that Jeremiah Snyder, was the militia leader given command of Fort Shandaken after Colonel Levi Pauling is the one who builds it. However, it did not remain in Snyder's hands for the rest of the war. In May of 1780, a small Indian war party appeared near Saugerties. And again, they're acting as kind of special forces soldiers at this point. One of the things they start getting used for is to try and kidnap Patriot war leaders. They're trying to take away the kind of talent, the officers, the leadership. And so they raid near Saugerties in May of 1780, and they take captive Captain Jeremiah Snyder as well as his son Elias. And they are both taken as prisoners to Canada, and they remain there for the duration of the war. But that's the really last engagement, I think, really, really directly relevant to Shandaken. And yet, these raids continue. Over the spring and summer of 1780, about 25 Esopus Indian warriors were involved in at least 5 expeditions to Ulster County, or Orange County today. The targets include the Saugerties area, the Shangam area, the Delaware River Valley as well. In February of 1781, another expedition comes down. They raid Coxsackie in that expedition. In August of 1781, at this point, nearly 400 warriors come down and raid the Rondout Valley. They burn dozens of homes around the settlements of Napanock and Wawarsing. And I mean, again, a devastating, devastating conflict. And they're acting as guides for the Haudenosaunee in conducting these raids when you see a larger contingent of 400 soldiers there as well. And yet, even as these raids are taking place, in the wider events, the war's coming to an end. That raid takes place right around the same time, or 2 weeks before the siege at Yorktown begins. And so although the fighting here is not declined whatsoever, fighting elsewhere does. And after the Battle of Yorktown, a month after that last raid I mentioned, the war functionally ends. And the Esopus are remaining as refugees to the northwest. And although raids continue the next couple of years, thankfully not to this area because of Fort Shandaken, although these raids continue, they had to ask themselves at that point, right? Like, what's the point? To what end is this being done now? And by 1780, so those following years, they're living as refugees around Fort Niagara. In 1784, they are officially given land over the border in Ontario, Canada, with the Haudenosaunee, and that is when the reservation there I mentioned earlier, the Six Nations of the Grand River, is formed, where their descendants reside to this day as the Delaware of the Six Nations. And with that, this area is opened up for further, now permanent European settlement as well. And in terms of our last question, what happens to the fort? We have 2 sources, and they're both contradictory, and neither of them are primary sources. So I wouldn't completely trust either of them. We don't know. Local lore says the fort was abandoned at the end of the war, or the alternative theory, and I like this one better. Me and Liz were talking about this before the presentation, that it was used as a temporary residence by the Winnie family, the first member of that family was a Dutch immigrant when he comes over. There are records from his family just 2 generations later, so it's plausible that story was passed down. They say that when he acquired the land in the early 19th century, that he used the fort as a temporary home while he built his own home on the site, which though is an indication that the fort wouldn't have been at the same site as the home that he builds. So we don't know entirely what happens, except that there's really not much need for it after the end of the war. And so again, we likely would know exactly where it was. We would know exactly what happened to it if not for those records burning in the Albany fire in 1911. And now, if I could just hold you guys for one more moment, though, I know I'm already way over on time. I do want to plug just one thing. So there's a website called nyheritage.org. It is a archival platform where all kinds of history organizations across New York are providing access to their digitized documents for free. And unfortunately, as I've mentioned a few times, we don't have many records from the Revolution in Ulster County surviving. One of the best groups of records we do have are pension applications. They are pension applications of Continental Army soldiers that are applying around 1820. And those pension applications, those soldiers are required, I should say, to give an account of their activity in the war, their activity in the Continental Army. They are our best source on soldiers from Ulster County in the Continental Army. Many of them were from Shandaken, even though they weren't fighting in this area and weren't at Fort Shandaken. And that is available for free. So again, that website is nyheritage.org. I encourage you to check out those resources. We just made those pension applications fully digitally available. So if you go on that website, again, nyheritage.org, under organizations, you'll find the Ulster County Archives. And again, I just wanted to say thank you all. And I know this might not have been the presentation you were necessarily expecting, not so much the story of what happens at Fort Shandaken, but more so the story of why Fort Shandaken was built. And subsequently, an argument to be made that Fort Shandaken is an important part of the process that then leads to the result of the American Revolution, which is that the towns that you all call home here in this region are founded or established in the aftermath of this really brutal, devastating conflict. And so, of course, here I have our flags of Ulster County, New York, and the United States, but also the flags of 2 of the Munsee reservations up in Ontario, but up there, our flag of the 6 nations of the Grand River, where the Delaware descendants reside to this day. So I'll say thank you all again so very much, and I'm happy to take as many questions as people have. Thank you. Go for it. I think you were up first.
So, during these raids and people, these troops traveling or militia, are they walking? Are they on horseback?
It's a fantastic question.
I,
We don't
how do
entirely
you
know.
walk so far? All these, it's just mind-boggling.
I mean, certainly the larger groups are on foot, for sure. There are rangers that are on horses at times. There are patrols that are on horses at times, but the larger groups would be going on foot. And so it's a mix of both. But yeah, I mean, it's remarkable. The case I mentioned where one of the man, I can't remember what year, I think it's 1780. But the Esopus warrior who is doing like reconnaissance from on top of Overlook Mountain, I believe he goes on foot. He goes from Fort Niagara to Overlook Mountain, manages to go to some farm in the area and steal an Ulster County newspaper, and he gets back there with under 3 weeks. That's mind-blowing. But the thing, I mean, they know this area. It's impossible to overstate how well they know the area. Every field, every stand-up, like, they know it like the back of their hand. It's partly why they're such effective soldiers in this area, why they can travel so quickly, but also so clandestinely and so effectively. Does anyone know what Shandaken means in Lenape? Yes, go for it.
River runs between hemlocks.
Yes. And there's a bit, some historians would argue spruce, some historians would argue hemlocks, but yeah, that's what that means. And that's a great example of how well they know the land. Every name they would have had for a place around here would tell them something about that place. And so they would have known it like the back of their hand. So yeah, on foot a lot of times, surprisingly. Go for it.
Can you talk about Colonel Rochester and the homestead that's attributed to him here in Shandaken?
I'll be completely honest with you. I don't know either of those things. Can you tell me a bit about?
Up Rochester Hollow, there's supposedly the site.
Oh, okay. Keep going, but.
That he settled on.
Yeah.
After the war.
Yeah, okay, that would make sense. I mean, it would be a very similar story. I don't know a lot about him particularly, but there was a fort in, I'm going to forget the name of it. It's going to kill me now. But there was a fort in what's now the town of Rochester as well, and it follows a very similar story. Actually, Rochester suffers more raids than Shandaken does in the war. Rochester, Saugerties gets a few, but really Rochester and Shangam are two areas that get hit particularly hard. Yeah, so I don't know a ton in detail except to know that there was a fort there stationed there for the same reasons, and that also kind of paves the way for settlement there afterward by Europeans. But now I have something that I have to go and read up on. Yeah, so just say his name one more time for me so I remember. It was
Colonel in the army in Rochester.
Colonel Rochester. Okay, I'm gonna look into that, and if you'd like to, I can give you a business card and I can look it up.
His homestead is nowhere near town, Rochester.
Oh, interesting.
His homestead is right up the road.
Oh, okay. Sorry for my misunderstanding. Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about him.
I think there were a couple
Yeah,
Colonel Rochester.
Here's the man to ask, truth be told. Yeah.
Yeah, that seems to be the case.
Okay,
And the latter one settled in this area,
cool.
but I'm not sure that's entirely accurate.
I believe the town of Shandaken 1976 bicentennial booklet, I believe he's mentioned in that. And I have that. I almost brought it, but I didn't bring it. But I'll do some more reading up on that afterward. Yeah, and if you'd like, I can give you a card and I can get back to you on that. Does anyone else have a question? Yeah.
Did any native people side with the revolutionaries?
Yeah. So, from just from the even the Haudenosaunee. So, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy had been in place, the Iroquois Confederacy, for hundreds and hundreds of years. It breaks in the Revolution. So the Oneida almost entirely side with the Americans, and a few, smaller groups of all the other nations side with the Americans. The Oneida en masse side with the Americans. That Battle of Oriskany in 1777 that the Esopus are at, that's the reason that George Clinton breaks the treaty. That battle it's still remembered to this day with a ton of really tragic meaning to the Haudenosaunee people, because that battle is where their Confederacy gets broken and they fight one another. But the Lenape suffer a similar fate. So the Wappingers people, the Mohican peoples, they side with the Americans. So some famous leaders like Daniel Nimmo, have any of you guys heard of him? He's a Wappinger war captain who fights on the American side in the Revolution as well. And then, plenty of other native communities from outside New York side with the Americans. The Unami the Munsees are almost entirely on the British side. But the Unami speakers around South, they're a fascinating case. I encourage you to do your own reading on. They try and stay neutral, and they actually kind of flee their homelands down into the Ohio River Valley. And then they're forced to pick their side by Daniel Boone and his group coming over into Kentucky. And so actually, if you want to read about the Unami Lenape experiences in the Revolution, the experiences of the Lenape now in Oklahoma, look up Daniel Boone's story in the Revolution. It's fascinating, but he's interacting with the Lenape. Daniel Boone actually was forcibly adopted by the Lenape at one point. So yeah, I really encourage you to read up on him. But yeah, so it's a kind of variety. Yeah. Anyone else have any other questions? Go for it.
Excuse the accent.
Nah. Where are you from?
Originally England.
My girlfriend is as well. I tease her. It's okay.
What were the Dutch doing during this time?
Great question. So, I mean, in one sense, all the people on the Ulster County militia, like a lot of them would be originally Dutch in nationality. And at this time, still a lot of them culturally and ethnically Dutch. Around the 1750s and 60s, though, you start to see momentum gain for assimilation to English culture, partly because more English colonists are moving in, but also it becomes a bit more fashionable for your average kind of Dutch American family to begin assimilating to English. The English language at the very least, English architecture, not the Anglican Church. That's when that's where they draw the line. They stay Dutch Reformed Church, but by this point, you would have a lot of these Dutch American families that would begin assimilating to English, but just as many of them would only be speaking Dutch still at this time period. Yeah. Now, the Dutch government, that's actually a fascinating question.
What did they side? I mean,
I don't know.
Who did they side with?
Now, in terms of like the Dutch government, I know that's a fantastic research question. I'd have to look into that a little bit. But, I think I've always wondered if part of the reason that New York City has a larger number of loyalists, whereas Albany and Ulster County are kind of hotbeds of patriot activity. I've always wondered if that doesn't have some connection, and this is a hard thing to prove, but if that doesn't have some connection to Dutch colonization here. These people aren't going to have necessarily the same loyalty to the British government when they've only been British citizens for maybe 3 generations, at that point, and they're still speaking Dutch even under the British government, So I think that's probably part of why Ulster County ends up on the side that it does. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. Where are you from in England, out of curiosity?
London.
Okay, cool. Yeah, my girlfriend was born in London, but she's from the Midlands.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Go for it.
I'm curious
curious about the population we're talking about of the Esopus Indians.
I'm so glad you asked about that.
Yeah, because I really don't have anything.
Yeah, and like we don't have a very firm number. We know around the time of the Esopus Wars that they're still numbering likely in the thousands total. They can form a group of a few hundred soldiers just for the Esopus, let alone you start talking about the other subgroups in the area. But around the revolution, their numbers would have been greatly reduced. We don't know entirely how many, but I mean, you know, you'll notice it's maybe the largest groups of purely Esopus soldiers, maybe 40 people, 50 people.
So we'd be talking about several
Maybe
thousand, not 10,000.
No, and by the revolution, it might even be less. It might even be a few hundred. But it's hard also because they're you know intermarrying and amalgamating with the other Lenape groups, and it's hard to get a firm population estimate for any of them, as well as with the Haudenosaunee. Yeah, the Haudenosaunee have thousands and thousands at that point, though. They're probably in the tens of thousands, but our Esopus people suffer a great deal. The Lenape in general would have thousands, though, as a whole. That's a great question. I should have mentioned that, honestly. So thank you for asking that. Yeah. Anybody else? Well, cool. I'll just say thank you all so much once again. I do have business cards, and the thing I always like to say as people head out is I work for all of you. I'm greatly privileged to work for all of you. I'm the first full-time historian Ulster County's ever had. Take advantage of that. Mind you, sometimes so many people take advantage of it, it could take me a little bit to get back to email requests. But that said, please take a business card if you're interested. If I can help with any history initiative, question, research, whatsoever, please reach out.